The CEO study is part of a series of studies that IBM conducts every couple of years and endeavours to find out what's front of mind for CEOs. So this year we released the study in May, and we did the interviews end of last year. But each year there's a particular theme. The theme for this year coming through very strongly was capitalising on complexity. Well, the key results were all about how CEOs capitalise on complexity and how they best manage a complex environment. The three key themes that came out were embracing creative leadership, reinventing customer relationships, and becoming a more dexterous or agile organisation. Well, it's interesting that for the first time we saw some differences in geographies in terms of the emphasis. So, for example, one of the questions that we ask is what are the top three external drivers or enablers? And we've measured that over the last 4 studies that we've done. It's interesting that market factors are still number one, but it's less so in people's minds, and then there's a close clustering of technology, people skills, and macroeconomic factors. And you'd imagine that with the global financial crisis, the macroeconomic factors has increased in importance. People skills has dropped a little, although interestingly in Australia and New Zealand that's still relatively high. And we think that's because our markets weren't as seriously affected as the US or Europe. But it is interesting to note that technology has gone from number 6 in the rank order back in 2004 to number 2 in 2010. So obviously, technology as an enabler is front of mind for most CEOs. If we look at different sectors and industries, I think something like about 17 different industries we analysed. And yeah, there are some significant differences. For example, in the public sector, as you can imagine, things like scarce money or budgets is top of mind for most public sector organisations. So for them, embracing creative leadership was very important. So how do they think outside the square? How do they look at new ways of providing services to their citizens or stakeholders? And also front of mind for them was the agility piece. So how do they become more efficient and effective operationally? So public sector had quite a different emphasis to, say, the retail sector, where their focus was very strongly around customers. How do we get closer to customers? How do we better understand their needs? How do we collaborate with them in coming up with new products and services? So that's just 2 examples that I can give around what we saw in terms of differences in industry. When we looked at an analysis of organisations in terms of financial success, obviously we had to separate out public sector organisations and privately owned. But those that were left where the financial information was publicly available, we looked at the short-term performance, i.e. over the last year, and the longer-term performance over the last 4 years. And quite clearly there was a group of organisations who were successful both in the short and the long term, and we called them the standout organisations. They were roughly about 25% of that sample. When we analysed what the complexity gap was, in other words, because one of the questions we asked organisations was, how much complexity do you anticipate facing over the next 5 years? And about 79% of the CEOs said, we anticipate a huge amount of complexity. Then we said, how ready do you feel for that complexity, and how ready do you feel in being able to handle that complexity? And less than 50% said they feel ready for it. So there's quite a big gap between the amount of complexity and how ready they are. However, standout organisations, the complexity gap was only 6%, negligible. So and obviously in their case they're saying, bring it on, we're ready for it. So standouts obviously were doing some things that others weren't, that we wanted to look at in more detail. Okay, so given that we've found that it's an increasingly more complex environment, the three key themes that came through that I mentioned previously around creative leadership, around reinventing customer relationships, and the agility or dexterity. I think the message to CEOs is you need to look at all three because they are so interdependent, and if you take a deeper dive into each area, there are things like, in the creative leadership space, there's things like being prepared to adopt slightly different communication styles and techniques. So the use of social media, for example, in making contact with your customers, your suppliers, other key stakeholders, and collaborating more with them. Also being prepared to break out of the industry mould and try new operating models and so on. So I think in that space there's some key messages. In the customer space, it's much more about, as I said before, how do we get customers inside our organisation to help them, or get them to help us define what our products and services should be, that more closely aligns with what their needs are. Also being prepared to invest in predictive analytics. So this is all the data about customers. What are they going to be doing in terms of customer trends, and how do we better meet their needs? And then if we look at the agility or dexterity space, the key aspects there I think that CEOs need to capitalise on is how do you create a more variable cost base, so reducing fixed costs and more variable costs. That could be achieved through having others do parts of your operation that are non-core, so strategic alliances or outsourcing. But also the ability to act with speed, make quick decisions, and also revise your or review your operating strategy and be prepared to change that on the run, so to speak. Yeah, well, we recently conducted both CFO and CIO studies globally, and these were done on the same basis, face-to-face. CIO study was 2,600, 1,900 for CFO, so major representation around the world. And it was clear that from those studies, their role in enabling the business was to the fore. So those more forward-thinking or high-performing CFOs and CIOs were very much around innovation. How do we enable the business to be more innovative? It was also around running efficient and effective functions within their own right, so an efficient and effective finance or IT function. It was also about how they collaborate with the senior management team in defining and implementing business strategy. So not sitting in a back room, tumbling the numbers or making the IT systems work, but more about being a fully operating member of the management team. And if they can do more of that, that will help, I think, CEOs focus on these three key themes that came out from the CEO study. The last CEO study, as I said before, was done in 2008, and the key theme there was around change, changing environment, and how much change is coming at organisations, and how successful have they been in managing change in the past. And we discovered there was a significant change gap, similar to the complexity gap, where a lot of organisations felt unready to manage effectively that change coming at them. So that was probably the major change in focus between the studies. Having said that, I think many of the themes are strongly linked between the two studies. as a result of doing the CEO study, we came up with a thing called the Complexity Readiness Assessment Tool, which is something that clients can use to assess how well they're doing in each of those three areas of creative leadership, customer and agility or dexterity. And it's really like laying a template over your organisation and looking at where the gaps might be between where you'd like to be and where you currently are, and then coming up with some recommendations for action for closing those gaps. So it's very much an assessment tool. It's done collaboratively with the organisation who would like to get a better view of where they are in that space, and then obviously further work would come from there in terms of the key recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
You can get a copy of the CEO study by talking to anyone within the Global Business Services group within IBM, or you can go to the IBM internet site and type in CEO study, and electronic copies are available. I believe you can also order hard copies online as well.